I once was speaking to a mashgiach, and he told me that in Slobodka, pre-war Slobodka, every once in a while the mashgiach would go over to someone and say, okay, you get up and speak. I was like, what, now? Oh yeah, right now, get up and speak. If you say, I don't have anything to say, he would say, you have nothing on your mind? So, since then I recognized that the ability to be able to get up and say something is important. It's practically important, and for our own growth, it's important. As a Rav, I try very, very, very hard not to go anywhere without an idea what I would say if someone would ask me to speak. Even though you could say, I didn't prepare, whatever, but it's not. For some reason, Rabbanim are supposed to magically always have a speech to give. So we try to always have a speech to give. So you could ask my son is sitting in the back. You could ask him, Yax. Hi, Yax. On the way when we're walking to a Shalom Zachar on Friday night, I'll always be like, okay, give me a minute, just in case they ask me to speak. And very often they don't, by the way. Very often I go to a place, I think about, what would I say if they would ask me to speak? And they don't ask me to speak. What terrible thing happened? I thought about it, Dvar Torah. It's not a terrible thing. Every once in a while I get lazy and I tell myself, okay, what are the chances they're going to ask me to speak? And then they always ask me to speak. Always. I did this in this yeshiva about 2 years ago. I came in, was it this time of day? It was a little earlier, actually. I think it was the 6 o'clock slot. And the guy sat down, and I just didn't feel the pull to give a lamdas shir. And I didn't even feel the pull to give a musar shir. I felt like it was maybe it was deep in the winter. Could be it was even raining, those days. And I felt a little bit the pull, please say something interesting. So on the spot, I changed my drasha, and I decided to speak about speaking. And we had a great time. I spoke about speaking. So I think I'm going to do that today as well, even though I'm sure that you are capable and have a cheshek to hear words of lamdas and halacha and machshava and musar, but there's something very, very, very important about being machshiv, the ability to express yourself. Take that as your dvar musar for the day, okay? The ability for a ben Torah to be able to express himself, to be able to get up and to, by a family simcha, and to say something that people are like, that was a nice speech. To get up by your afra from Eretz Hashem and be able to speak and thank your parents and make a couple of well-placed jokes and say a dvar Torah and of course don't forget to praise your father-in-law, your future father-in-law, and so on. These types of things, to MC by your son's bar mitzvah. It's not a small thing to be able to do that, to be able to get up and to MC by your own children's bar mitzvahs or simchas in Eretz Hashem. So I want to talk about a few principles of speaking. Is that okay? Is that a good idea?
Sure.
I want to talk about a few principles.
What? You're the speaker.
But I'm asking your opinion. Okay, we'll have to talk about what to do about guys that interrupt the speech. No, I'm just kidding. So I want to talk about a few principles of speaking that I've discovered. They're not, if you get Dale Carnegie's The Art of Speaking, you're not going to hear necessarily these things. Partly because I have my own experiences, and partly because we live in a very specific world. Like Dale Carnegie, you can search that book from beginning to end, you will not find anything about how to quote psukim. You know that, right? We have a very unique world that we live in, and the speeches that we give are very unique because of that. And it's important to know that. Okay? So I'm going to start off from the beginning, meaning I'm going to start off talking about the beginning of speech. And then we'll talk about the content of the speech. And then we'll talk about the end of the speech. And then we'll end the speech at the end of the speech, which reminds me, what time does it end? Is there a time? 8:45. Okay. Because I'll just jump to the end and tell you one of the most important, and I do not mean this as a joke at all, one of the most important principles of speaking is to finish on time. And one of the most frustrating things, you can ask your Rebbe he doesn't have to give it away to me, but you can ask your Rebbe. One of the most frustrating things about having guest speakers is when you're trying to run a yeshiva and they go overtime. It's frustrating. And the guys that are sitting, what's interesting is the guys that are sitting and listening to the speech, even if you're an incredible Ben Torah and you're intelligent and you love learning, but when the speech is supposed to be over and it's not, how easy is it to think then? It's not happening. So everyone's wasting their time then. The speaker's wasting his time, the listeners are wasting the time, and it's messing up. And it's not just in a yeshiva. If you're asked to speak by a simcha, and you say to them, which is a wise thing to do, to say, how long would you like me to speak? And they say, between 7 and 10 minutes. By the way, between 7 and 10 minutes means 7 minutes. Okay? In fact, your Rebbe just said 8:45, and I heard 8:43. That's what I heard. Okay? Because nobody ever, I've been speaking for 25 years, nobody ever came over to me and said, you ended too soon. It never happened. Okay? That doesn't happen. So to end a drop before even the time, but sometimes it happens by a family simcha. I'm not saying this you should criticize other people, by the way. Yaks, I'm not saying this you should criticize other people. Okay? I'm just, but in your mind, you should know that when someone gets up by a family simcha, and he starts speaking, and he says a Dvar Torah, and he rambles on, and especially painful is when he says, and that reminds me. And you're like, keep it to yourself. Does it happen to remind you of something? Do you have to say everything that comes to your mind? So these types of things are important, but let's start from the beginning, okay? Starting a speech, the first 5 seconds, I would say, of a speech, you already either own the crowd or don't own the crowd within 5 seconds. Okay, one of the things that I taught my children from day one, my children can't even do it. They have an allergy to it at this point because of how often I've said it, is that you should never, there is an exception to this rule, I'll tell it to you in a minute. You should never, ever, ever start a speech with the following 2 phrases. Either it says in this week's parsha, never start a speech with the words it says in this week's parsha, and never start a speech with the words it says in the Gemara. Okay? If you do that, you lost half the crowd immediately. Okay? We have this thing, my kids have this thing, because when I used to speak about this, I used to say, it's like you see the lights go off. So you say, in this week's parsha, and you see, you see the lights go off, and every once in a while, and I apologize for this, every once in a while we'd be attending a speech, and someone would get up and say, it says in this week's parsha, and I would see one of my kids go. And it's true. It's true. Because, and if you think about it, I am not saying not to start with the pasuk. I'm not saying not to start with the Gemara. I'm just saying not to start with the words it says in the Gemara or in this week's parsha, because unfortunately hundreds of thousands of boring speeches have started that way. So I would say things like, if I was quoting a pasuk in Tehillim, I would start off my speech saying, with tremendous joy, David HaMelech sang, Haidu Lashem ki tov ki li'olam chazdai. Instead of saying, it says in Tehillim, Haidu Lashem ki tov ki li'olam chazdai. Which speech are you more likely to listen to?
The first one.
And then when it comes to Gemara as well, in an intense conversation or intense debate between Abaye and Rava, the subject of was discussed or something like that. Things like that bring your listener to want to hear what you're saying. The exception is if you're giving a shir, your Rebbe in shir is there to teach Torah, and you're there to learn Torah. It's not about entertainment. Learning Torah in a yeshiva from a Rebbe in a shir klali, it should start. It says in the Gemara says, Itmar, this and that, Rav Amar this, Shmuel Amar that. That is how a shir should go. When you're doing a chabura or a shir, so then you're not there to entertain the olam. If you're a guest speaker, then you are there. Then you have to, because you have to earn their respect or earn their willingness to listen to you. So we don't start off with, it says in the Gemara, we don't start off with the pasuk, it says in this week's parsha, or the pasuk says, we don't do that. I like even saying in yesterday's Kriya, it's a little better. Just change it up. But there's another phrase that you should never, ever, ever, ever start a speech with this phrase. And that phrase is, Paischin b'chvoid achsanya. Okay? I don't know if you guys have been around enough to know how often speeches start with those words. Paischem b'chvayid achsanya is a way of saying I will begin by honoring the person, my host. It's a way of starting off thanking your host. And it's very acceptable and appropriate when you're asked to speak to thank the person that asked you to speak or allowed you to speak, to thank your host. But from circles, Paischem b'chvayid achsanya became like that kind of, there we go. People even do it with a niggin, Levi, you know that, right? It's like there's already a niggin. If there's a niggin to something, you know you're in trouble. Okay? So do not start with Paischem v'chvayid achsanya. Say it in English, how about that? Say, I really am grateful to this yeshiva for allowing me to speak today. We speak English. We don't have to pick the words. And by the way, I explained to you what Paischem b'chvayid achsanya means. Many people, I've heard speakers start with the words Paischem b'chvayid achsanya. They have no idea what Paischem b'chvayid achsanya means. So it's not a wise thing. But I want to tell you something else. If you want to be a sophisticated speaker, it's wise to not start off thanking the host at all, because it's boring, but to try to weave it in the course of your speech, to weave in the thank you. And it sounds much more authentic when you do that. So if I was speaking, let's say we had a lander event in Eretz Yisrael. So Levi Friedman would drive me there because he drives me all over and arranges my transportation. And I'm very grateful for that. But if I would start off saying, I'd like to thank Levi Friedman, he wouldn't appreciate it, I wouldn't appreciate it, and the Olam would not appreciate it. But if in middle, I called out to him something, I said, so Levi, which by the way, I want to mention how grateful I am to Levi for kach v'kach, that's authentic. That's real. When the by the way thank you is a very, very, very appropriate and it's alive. It doesn't just sound like I have to say, like also the speeches that start with long birshusas, birshus, maranan, v'rabanan, v'rabaisai, rabbanim, kayanim, geirim, I don't know what, you don't have to do that. Okay? So we start a speech not with it says in the Gemara, not with it says in the Pasuk, not with Paischem b'chvayid achsanya, but with something interesting. Now, there's a false myth out there in the world that you're supposed to start with a joke. And I know many of you have heard that, I'm sure. You're supposed to start a speech with a joke. And it's also not true. Okay, the only time it makes sense to start with a joke or a sharp line is if it pertains to the speech. Okay? Like, for example, my wife is one of 11 siblings. She's the oldest of 11 siblings. And most of her siblings are sisters. So there's 8 sisters. Okay? So, and they're very, 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 very smart women. Okay? So, I one time got up by a family simcha and said, it is truly an honor to speak in front of a room of such tremendous Talmidei Chachamim and their husbands. That's what I said. Okay? So that way I said something a little funny, a little sharp, but it had to do a little bit with the speech. It had to do with the fact that I was speaking. It was a family speech, and a lot of these women, I'm married to the oldest, so I helped them get through school, and I got the calls from Eretz Yisrael when they were in seminary and they had tests, so I knew that they would tell me the Chachamim, so to speak, whatever. I once spoke in my daughter's high school, and trying to remember the exact line. All right, it'll come to me. But lines like that to try to a joke, a story, a remark, a line, and you could prepare it before. Sometimes if you're comfortable speaking, you could think of things on the spot, but don't count on that. You could prepare it before. But the idea of an American and a Polish guy and whatever came into a bar, do not start your speech like that. Okay? It's not It's not helpful. It's not classy. It's not, unless it has something to do with what's happening. And people find the cheesiest ways to connect it to what's happening. I'm not a fan of that. It's not, don't do that. Be funny, be sharp, but be sharp in the content. Okay, so those are all the ways not to start a speech. So now you started your speech, but what are you speaking about? So it's important to try this. How many of you, just by a show of hands, have spoken in public? Okay, a nice amount. How many of you, let's say, spoke by a Sheva Brachas? Okay, I'm trying to see where the rest of you spoke. Okay, an Afraf? A Bar Mitzvah? Your own Bar Mitzvah? I'm not talking about your own Bar Mitzvah. Okay? A Bar Mitzvah? Siblings Bar Mitzvahs. So a lot of times when you're doing a Sheva Brachas and Afraf for Bar Mitzvah, so your job when you speak is to praise the Baal Simcha, right? That is your job. So I want to give you just a word of advice about that. It's a good idea when you speak to speak about one thing. It sounds like you're desperate. When you're looking, sometimes you could say, I have two things to say, but that's rare. In general, a speech should be about one thing. If I'm trying to talk about a chassan, I'm trying to bring out one mila about the chassan. And I'm bringing it out in a delicious way. And I have a ton of stories. And I have funny things that happened. But it's all to bring out. There's a theme. My whole speech is about one thing. People do not like, and you know how I can prove this? Because you do not like, when people give a speech and then they're like, and another thing. No, did you ever hear someone speaking say, and another thing? You were like, yes, another thing. No. It was like, really? Could you say that for the next speech? Right? So when you speak about one topic and keep it focused on one topic. Also, when you speak, this may sound obvious, but it's not. When you speak, prepare for your speech. Okay? Unprepared speeches sound unprepared. Okay, now sometimes you have to be down the kaf schus. I was recently by a dinner, and there was a tremendously famous Rav there, and he had a bunch of papers in front of him, and they were clearly just copies from his sefer that he printed. I'm just going to borrow this for a second. And he had his papers in front of him, and as he's talking, you see that he's trying to find like the next point that he wanted to say in the papers, and then the light over his stender wasn't so good, so he couldn't really read it properly, so he's like trying to squint. It was obvious that he hadn't prepared. Obviously. Like, you knew the topic he wanted to say, but it wasn't coming. The next thing wasn't coming. And I started in my mind, because I care about good speeches, I started to get annoyed. Like, you came to speak in front of 150 people. Why didn't you come prepared? And then I criticized myself that I have no right to be dan shaloi l'kaf schus. If you have a Rosh Yeshiva that's driving somewhere to give a speech, I'm imagining to us he probably thought he'll prepare in the car, and then probably an emergency came up while he was in the car, and he probably had to answer 14 shilas and deal with 15 crises, and then he showed up and he had to speak, and sometimes the people that are asked to speak are also the ones that are dealing with crises, and you can't really judge them. So I'm not here to throw judgments, criticism to put down if someone who's a big person shows up to give a speech, someone who's a very busy person, and they're not prepared. But a lot of times, people don't prepare just because they're not being machshiv the people that they're speaking to. In fact, and this is one of the big no-nos in speaking, do not get up to speak and say these words. I'm not really prepared, but do not do that. And every single time I hear someone get up and say that, I'm not really prepared, but in my mind, I'm always thinking to myself, if you're not prepared, sit down. No? You're not prepared. If this tzibur was not chashuv enough for you to prepare to speak for, so then don't speak. If this tzibur is chashuv enough for you to prepare to speak for, so prepare. Is that reasonable? You're not sure? What? I think it's what? That's a different thing. That is a different thing. If the Baal Bayis asks you to speak on the spot, not everyone is going to prepare a speech just in case. If you are asked to speak on the spot, so then I agree with you. But I would say, Levi, if you're that Baal Bayis and you ask someone to speak on the spot, when you introduce the person, say that you asked them to speak on the spot. It's not nice to him. Because then he has to make this very funny judgment call. I just got up to speak. I didn't know it's happened to me 1,000 times. I didn't know I was going to speak. I was just asked to speak. So I don't want anyone to think that this is how I speak, because I'm kind of like groping for words and I'm not sure what comes next, and so I'm not sure. So I don't know, what do I do? Should I get up and just like make believe that this is how I speak? I'm kind of embarrassed to do that. Should I say, by the way, I just want to say before I start, I didn't know I was speaking. It sounds like I'm like, it also doesn't sound classy. What's classy is if the person that introduces me says, I know he wasn't planning to speak, but I asked Levi Friedman if he could please get up and say a few words. Then it clears you from having to do that. And then it makes you the hero, and if a speech comes out good, that's amazing. Okay? So that's good. But very often people are told in advance that they're going to speak. How many of you have been by simchas where people get up and it's like, I'm not really prepared. If you're not prepared, I feel that way about a Balkairi that's not prepared also, you know. If you're not really prepared, don't speak. It's just, and I'm saying this in a humorous way, but I really mean it in a musar way. Klal Yisrael, you are chashuv. And you deserve that someone who's presenting someone to you should present something that's a polished thing to present. And if I'm not going to do that, I'm not being machshav you. You didn't come here to just hear me wander around and play around with my thoughts and not really sure what I'm going to say. That's not why you're here. You're here to hear something cogent, that's put together, that's articulate, that's a point, that has a beginning and a middle and an end. That's what you came for. And if I'm not willing to do that to you, I'm not respecting you. That's how I feel anyway. So be prepared. And if, God forbid, for whatever reason you're not prepared, don't get up and say, I'm not really prepared. Don't do that. It's not classy. You get up and you do the best you can. Prepare as best as you can and deliver as best as you can. Now, keeping people's interest in a speech could become difficult. And what ends up happening sometimes is that speeches sometimes I prepared, and as I'm speaking, I suddenly feel like I'm losing the crowd, like they're just not with me anymore. Okay, I don't know if any of you, if this has happened to, the Rabbeim in the room for sure have experienced that. Like suddenly I don't feel like I have the crowd anymore. And sometimes there are things that interrupt the crowd. Like I'm in the middle of speaking. Imagine if I was in the middle of speaking. I met a few days ago Rabbi Levi Friedman. You don't know this. Rabbi Levi Friedman has the cutest grandson in history. Okay? I met him. I testify. Okay? So imagine this tiny, how was he 2, 1.5? How old is he? What? 1.5. I imagine this cute kid starts running across the base medrash. I'm toast. I could be saying the most interesting thing in the world, and Levi Friedman's grandson is running across the room. I'm done. So how do we deal with that? And there's two different things. It's losing the olam's interest, problem number 1, or there's a distraction, problem number 2. Okay? So in problem number 1, losing the olam, it's a difficult thing. If you start losing, sometimes it's an indication, if you're by a simcha or something, it's an indication that you should try to wrap it up. Time to wrap it up. You know, obviously you can't skip, but it's time to wrap it up. One of the indications that it's time to wrap it up, if you hear chairs moving. Do you know that thing when it starts getting to the end of a speech? Also, it happens, by the way, when the speech gets awkward also. Suddenly you start hearing shuffling. You hear the chairs shuffling. When a Rebbe goes overtime on a share, listen to the chairs. Listen. The chairs start shuffling. Okay, that's an indication. But if I once spoke by a simcha. Better not go overtime. I once spoke by a simcha. I once spoke by a simcha where I started speaking. It started in the Ezra's Nashim, but it extended to the men's section also. Everyone's just talking so loud. I'm talking, they're talking. I can't handle it. I couldn't. There are some speakers that could just go on. They're oblivious, but I couldn't do that. And it bothered me very, very, very much. And I lost that speech. Like, it was not a good speech. I ended it. I felt stupid. They probably felt stupid. It was a bad experience. But then, I had a 3-hour drive from that place, that simcha, to my house. And on the way home, both to the trip, I was like, what could I have done? What could I have done? What could I have done? Because I want to make the speech work. And I realized what I could have done is, I could have continued my speech like this. And I could have started walking into the olam. And now I have every single person in the room right here. I could have done that. I could have not hid behind my shtender, hiding behind the stender is a terrible, terrible, like zone out Yetzer Hara, because you're used to that, the guy behind the stender, but now I'm right here, and it's hard to ignore me. So that's one thing to do. When there's a I'm going quickly because I do want to finish on time, but when there's a distraction that happens in the middle, when there's like the kid walking through, you have to make a judgment call. Is it worth saying something about it? Rabbi Kalish, speaks a lot of times in situations where there's no way that another person would be able to get through with that amount of disruption. I've seen him speak. Yax, you know what I'm talking about? He could speak, and there are guys drumming. There's songs being sung. He could just speak through it, and it's something I've discussed with him many times, that he's able to power through like that. But sometimes it is worth saying, cutest kid ever. For the speaker to not be trying to ignore that there's a cute kid walking through. Sometimes it works to just make a point of it. You pointed it out, and then you have to make that judgment call. Okay? It's getting to the end of my speech, so I just want to spend a minute speaking about ends of speeches. Okay? One of the most important things when you give a speech is to know how you're going to end it. Because as a great ha'ara, one of my mispalim once have, is that he said to me, one time he criticized me that I end my speeches twice. I say, and that's the pshat in the pasuk. So according to this, we understand what the pasuk is saying. It's because sometimes you end the speech and it didn't really end. So he compared it to the landing gear on an airplane coming down. He's like, if the plane is landing and the wheels don't come down, it's a crash landing. You have to know how you're ending the speech. And that's a very important thing, to end the speech smoothly. I know how this is ending. And this speech, which I'm going to end now because I want to end on time, this is the time, right? Right. So I really am usually smoother about it, but I'm trying to demonstrate how we really finish a speech on time. This speech I'll end with that I hope that this was beneficial. And it's not just the specific advice that I gave you. I hope that you could take with me my love for being able to craft a well-given speech. And if you could enjoy that, Eretz Hashem, all of you will develop your own list of things that make a good speech, and you'll be able to have divrei Torah and words of chizuk that you'll be able to share with the world around you. Yashakaya.